In this clip, we're going to learn how to edit the nav mesh. Alright, so in the last clip, we baked out our nav mesh and we basically just used the default options. But we have a lot of problems with the nav mesh. It's on objects that it really shouldn't be, and we really don't have a lot of room here in the scene. And I want to create a little bit of a different behavior, like being able to walk through these ferns and small plants. So to get started with this, let's talk about how to remove the nav meshes on top of these rocks. Whenever you bake out a nav mesh, you need to make sure that your objects that are in the scene are set to navigation static. And so that's what is going to include it in the navigation bake. So if I were to select all of these rocks around the outside, I could come in and I could go to the inspector and set the navigation static to off. So that way they're not included in the bake. Now there's going to be a little bit of a problem with this whenever we rebake this out. So let's go ahead and hit bake. And you'll notice that on top, everything has come off. And it looks like we missed one of the objects, or a couple of them. Let's go ahead and go to the inspector. Let's set their navigation to static. Yes. And let me go back. There we go. Just to turn it off. And then we'll go in and we'll bake this out again. And you'll see that the nav mesh is gone across the top. However, if we look underneath where the terrain is, you'll notice that the nav mesh is inside of those rocks. And the player could possibly click on these areas, and the player would go right through the wall to where it's trying to go. So these objects still need to be included in the bake, but they need to be defined as objects that are not walkable, or areas that are not walkable. So let's go back to the inspector. Let's go to the static dropdown and include them back in the navigation static category. And then let's go to navigation. And with these rocks selected, I'm going to go to object. And here I can define the navigation area. Now, navigation areas are defined in the areas section. Here you can see that we have the built-in areas. So we have walkable, not walkable, and jump. You can see the cost of each one of those areas. If a navigation agent has to jump to get to a certain point, it may look for a easier route that is just walkable. So if you have a ledge that the character has to jump up, and then right next to it a set of stairs that the character can walk up, the character will always walk up to that point. Now it is dependent on distance, so if it's shorter to actually jump up the ledge and then get to the point, then it will use that method of pathfinding. It's also important to note that you can modify your areas and you can add in your own for your own purposes. You can modify what those costs are. So for example, let's say that we have water in the scene and we want the navigation agents to completely avoid water. We could make them not walkable, or what we could do is create a water area and then set a really high cost. Perhaps it's the only way through and they will have to use water. So we can always define things that way. Now let's go back to our objects and let's set the navigation area from walkable to not walkable. Let's hit yes to change the children, and then we're going to go to bake and then rebake. So now you'll see that there really wasn't much of a change, except for the terrain is no longer being affected underneath those rocks. And so now we're left with just our nav mesh that's right here at the bottom. Let's talk about how to modify this nav mesh that's on the terrain and how it's interacting with the plants. I would like to be able to walk through these small plants, and so I'm going to actually select them in the scene, and instead of setting them to not walkable or whatever, we're actually going to modify these to where they are part of the navigation bake. And I want them to be walkable. So that way I can actually just walk through these plants and I don't have to worry about it. Now these larger sets of plants, I would leave those alone because I want to give the idea that they are too thick to walk through. And so with these just selected, let's go to the inspector. Let's make sure that they are not part of the navigation bake and being chosen as obstacles. And let's actually, you know what, we could exclude them from the navigation bake. Yes, let's just exclude them. So that way we can just walk through them. They're just being ignored by the navigation bake at this point. So that's exactly what we want. So let's go to navigation and bake. And now you'll see that our nav mesh will allow us to go through these particular plants. So I could click right on this and walk right in the middle of it. And perhaps we have some sort of cloth component on these plants and it creates some sort of interactive feature to it to where it looks like we're actually walking through the leaves and they're interacting with the player. So now that we have that all set, the last thing that we would want to look at is the character or the dummy that's here. And the dummy is going to be a dynamic object. We don't want it to be in place and whenever we hit it and the health runs out, we don't want it to stay there. We want it to destroy or disappear. And so we have to leave this object as dynamic, meaning we can't check it as static in the scene. And so what we would do in this case is we would use a component called NavMesh obstacle. So a NavMesh obstacle is basically looking at an object that we would normally mark as static, and it's looking at this object and is saying, okay, this object is going to be static for a little bit, but it has the possibility of being destroyed, and we want to rebake the nav mesh at runtime. And so what I can do is let's go ahead and select our dummy. Let's go to Add Component, and I'm going to go to Navigation, Nav Mesh Obstacle. You'll notice here that it's giving me the shape of the obstacle that I want to cut out for this object. Let's go ahead and switch it to Capsule. Let's set the Y value to 0.5, and that should be all that we need to do. Now we want to be able to carve out from the nav mesh, so we're going to set that to carve, and then we can modify those parameters. Now we could set this to carve only stationary objects, or we could tell it to carve out even animated objects. In this case, this object is going to be static, and it's not going to move. However, we are telling it that if it does get destroyed, it needs to rebake the nav mesh. So let's see what this looks like. Let's go to our navigation section here, and you'll notice that it has already carved out this object. And so the player would be able to click through and be able to click on the dummy, and he would move up and then start to attack the dummy. Now, what happens whenever the dummy itself is destroyed? Well, let's go ahead and simulate that. If I were to hit play, and let's go to our scene view here, and I went to the inspector, and while we're playing, somehow it gets destroyed, or turned off or something like that. If I go to navigation, you'll notice that the navigation mesh has resurfaced itself as if the object was never here. Now this is really important because if we were to destroy an object and then it's still being counted or cut out in this area, the player would go around nothing, and that would break the immersion. So navigation obstacles are really, really cool feature, and they can create different pathways based on gameplay. So you could use this for something like doors. So let's say that there's a doorway, and the door is just cutting off the nav mesh agent, and it's waiting until it's opened. And once it's opened, it's going to rebake that and allow the player to go through the doorway. So that's how we can refine our nav meshes. Now let's talk about how to use nav mesh agents and talk about how we can get our player to start moving around in the scene.